everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Women in Work, Why It Matters, brought to you by the International Center for Research on Women and Feminism in India. We are your hosts. I'm Purnima.
And I'm Nilanjana.
And today we're going to be talking about the world of women and work. Nilanjana, this topic is actually personally very close to me because working really matters to me. I grew up watching my mother work, and she always encouraged me to work as well. Well, work for something that I'm passionate about. But surprisingly, teachers, neighbors, or even the parents of my classmates, and sometimes even our own relatives, would ask her, why do you choose to work, or why do you keep working? Your kids have grown up, so you should take care of your kids first. Of course, my father wasn't being asked the same question.
I know, Purnima, and I can absolutely resonate with what you're saying because my mother was also a working professional, and she faced the same sort of questions. But very importantly, I had a couple of aunts. So one of my aunts was actually a widow, and another aunt was going through a very difficult marriage. And I do realize that the kind of work that they used to do not only brought in the much needed income, but it gave them a sense of confidence, a sense of independence, and a sense of dignity with which they were able to face a lot of the challenges in their personal life. So, for me, actually, from a very young age, work became something that one needed to have, not only because one was passionate about it, but because it gave one a sense of purpose and dignity. So I just want to say that, I'm really excited to be hosting this podcast series because it talks about women and work. And this podcast series is part of the Rebuild COVID-19 and Women in the Informal Economy project of ICRW. The study is being carried out in Kenya, Uganda, and India by the International Center for Research on Women, that is ICRW, with the support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the International Development Research Center, that is IDRC. With this study, we aim to understand how COVID-19 related health and economic shocks and the policy responses to them interact with the pre-existing gender and other social norms to impact livelihoods, experience of gender-based violence, and sexual and reproductive health outcomes for women who work in the urban informal economy. If you want to know more about the project, people, please visit our website. It's www.icrw.org/Asia.
I also just want to say that given the context of the pandemic, the very definition of work has been rapidly changing in India and even across the world. So this presents an opportunity and actually a great need to address the existing gender disparities and social norms that govern women's economic participation. This podcast series specifically aims to understand how norms have been dictating employment and work trends pre and post pandemic, the barriers to work and livelihoods for women, and the measures required to increase and expand the participation of women and girls in different spheres of work. So, join us as we navigate through the complex world of women and work and explore how to chart out a gender responsive recovery plan for building back a better world.
Great. Purnima, I want to share with all of you that we have a fantastic guest with us today, and I'm really, really honored to have this opportunity of, sharing a discussion with her. So we have with us Ashwini Deshpande, who is a professor of economics and the founding director of the Center for Economic Data and Analysis at Ashoka University. She has been working on the economics of discrimination and affirmative action, with a focus on caste and gender in India. She has published extensively, as you know, in leading scholarly journals, and we are really, really excited to have her with us. Welcome, Ashwini. Really look forward to a wonderful discussion with you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to meet both of you, and I'm very excited to be talking to you today.
Great. So we'll just start then. I think right off the bat, what I would like to discuss is, despite more women and girls getting access to higher education, they are dropping out of the workforce in large numbers. And everybody has been raising alarm at this decreasing number of women in the workforce in our country. So, Ashwini, why do you think this is a cause for concern for our economy?
Well, I'll actually step back a little bit and I will question the assertion that greater number of women are dropping out. So I have a paper, which is my latest paper with my PhD student at Ashoka, Jayant Singh. And what we show in that paper is that it's not that fewer women are working, it is that the opportunities for women to work are fewer. And this point has been made by others as well, which is that demand for female labor, for a variety of reasons, has not kept pace with the supply of female labor. So I know that the mainstream view is that women are just dropping out, they don't want to work, or they are not being allowed to work. But I personally have a different interpretation, and this is not just my argument. Many people have made this argument, which is it's the demand for women's labor that is a problem, not the supply of women's labor.
That's a very interesting point you make, Ashwini. I'm also recalling a lot of conversations I've had with scholars, with activists, and a lot of papers have come out on this. That if we look at it from perhaps even the supply side, you talk about the demand side, and that's very critical. But if we also look at the supply side, I feel one of the critical barriers that women face in accessing paid employment, so paid work, is the fact that there is a huge burden of unpaid work on women, which is inflexible. So, and this unpaid work is not just domestic work and care work. This is also, their work is unpaid helpers in family businesses and family farms, etc. And this sort of inflexible, unpaid work responsibilities also limit the time she has to participate in paid work. So, can you just tell us a bit about, what you think about this, and what is the difference between paid and unpaid work? What are the kinds of work women engage in?
So I again like to unpack this a little bit, what you said, which is that, let's look at the last thing that you said, which is work on family enterprises. Now, it's not as though men who work on family enterprises, it's not always the case that they work on family enterprises and go out and work. No. So, but the point is that when they work on family enterprises, they are counted as workers. So a male farmer, for example, he's counted as a farmer, as a worker, right? Or an artisan, or a potter, or a weaver, or a kirana shop owner, or, think of any of the. So these are livelihood activities for the family. And the men who work on these activities get counted as workers. But women who work on these activities don't get counted as workers. So I don't think we should be looking at it as over and above all this, where is the time for women to go out and work? It's impossible because there are only 24 hours in a day. So if you're doing domestic chores, then that's 24 hours. There's no other time. For example, in my paper with Naila Kabir, when we talk about the supply side constraint of domestic work, we are not referring to unpaid economic work. That is the work for which the woman should be counted. This shows that if she had been a man, she would have been counted in the labor force. So that explains the low levels of recorded female labor force participation rates.
Absolutely.
What prevents them from accessing paid work is the other type, is the reproductive labor that they have to do in the home. So because the reproductive labor is predominantly the woman's responsibility, that doesn't leave her with enough time. But if she's already working on the family economic enterprise, then she should be just counted as a worker, just as the men in her family who are working on the family enterprises would get counted.
Right.
So I think that we need to understand the unpaid component in two different dimensions.
So this point that you bring up about women being counted as workers, no matter the kind of work that they do, we can, like, it can be paid or it can be unpaid. I also just want to talk a little bit about, like, how is women's work seen, be it whether it's paid or it's unpaid. It is just not valued. So I would say not by the state, not by the community, not by the family, like you mentioned, and not even by, sometimes I would say, the worker herself. So how would you say, like, what is the value attached to women's work?
So it's different for different categories. So the point about unpaid work, which is important to understand, is that women see the unpaid work that they do on family enterprises as a part of their routine domestic chores. So it is undervalued in the sense that they don't view themselves as workers, and their family doesn't value their labor because it's supposed to be a part of what they should be doing anyway. Now, when you talk about family enterprises, you're not working for an employer. It's your family's economic activity that is generating the money, right? So in that sense, no one person is paid. It's just that the woman worker does not have equal rights over the earnings of the family enterprise. So you have to view it a little bit differently, as opposed to being working for another employer where you get a pay, right? So when we talk of unpaid work, we are really talking about family enterprises where each member may not be paid separately, but their contribution to the success of that enterprise is recognized. When you work when you work for an employer, that's where the question of gender discrimination comes in, which is that when you look at wage gaps, uh, for the same kind of work, men get paid more than women in paid employment everywhere in the world. When we think of value, you have to think of it in different ways. It's not one answer for all. So women who work on family enterprises are not counted as workers by the statistical system. They don't see themselves as workers, economic workers. They just feel like they're just doing domestic work. And women who work for other employers either are sort of predominantly informal, but that's true of all workers in India, which is workers are, it's about um, 80 more than 80 to 85% of workers in India, male and female, work in the informal sector. I think the question of value has to then be unpacked a little bit and understood a little bit differently for different categories of women.
Absolutely, Ashwini. I think you make a very important point, and you're right in saying that depending on the kind of work women are performing, the question of valuation has to be contextualized and understood. But whichever kind of work we look at, there is a question of devaluation, undervaluation, there is a question of discrimination depending on where she is in the economy and what she's doing. But I think I have also wanted to reflect a little bit on, in general, some of the critical barriers that women face when they try to access work, or even in terms of their sustenance in certain forms of employment, say their sustenance in paid work. Because, like, gender segregated labor markets that you talked about, wage gaps, these are all barriers, as is the barrier in terms of unpaid care burden, domestic work burden. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, and maybe point us in the direction of some other barriers that women face?
Oh, any number of them. So basically, starting from what you mentioned, which is domestic, predominant responsibility of reproductive labor, domestic chores, and in this dimension, South Asia is among the worst, exhibits the worst forms of gender inequality. Women spend as much as 10 times the time that men spend on domestic chores. So but I feel that we need to understand that the inequality in the domestic sphere and the inequality in the public sphere, which is paid employment, mirrors each other. So because women are few, so it's a vicious circle right now. So women are not going out to work, so they're doing more work at home, and because they're doing more work at home, they can't go out to work. So where does this vicious cycle break? That's a question for policy. But in terms of undervaluation, you're absolutely right. Whether it is the notion that if women do it, it must be easy, or or often even in upper middle class jobs, where the labor laws are, in the formal sector, for example, where you can't discriminate so openly on the basis of wages. So wages you may not discriminate, but women get saddled with a whole lot of other equivalent of care work in the office. So organizing birthday parties, reminders for somebody's wedding present, or social occasions, or Diwali party, Christmas party. So who are the ones who are so it's sort of an extension of the role at home. And even in a university setting, students, for example, are much more brutal when it comes to assessing female professors as opposed to male professors. So they are willing to take much more direct comments from male professors, but when female professors give a direct comment, the women are regarded as rude. She was rude, she didn't listen. Whereas if the male professor says, well, figure it out on your own, they take that as something that they, so there's acceptance of male authority in a way that there isn't an easy acceptance of female authority. And the same traits in a man are seen positively, that, oh, he's very ambitious, he's driven, he takes initiative. Whereas woman, she's aggressive, she's BIXXX, she's all kinds of things, So uh, women who speak their mind, women who speak loudly, women who have opinions, these are the not traits that are considered feminine. So yeah, you see these stereotypes working in all classes of women. But by the way, what we should always remember is that India is not unique in at least this latter dimension that I mentioned. So, at the end of the day, there's patriarchy everywhere, So India might have a particularly, at certain levels, the patriarchal expressions might be greater in the sense of the domestic sphere. But in the West, where it may not be so much at the domestic sphere, but in the public sphere, all of these issues are equally, critical, and the Western feminists have consistently been raising it. So I just want us to have that perspective a little bit, which is, it's not as though India is a little island of patriarchy and patriarchy is dead everywhere else. No, I think it takes different forms depending on the context.
No, I think we can find someone asking or expecting the women in the room to take notes or organize a birthday party everywhere. I don't think that's an India specific thing. I think that I will find anywhere in the world. But like, speaking of barriers also, another sort of very critical aspect that affects women's ability to participate, and not just participate, also like sustain in the workforce, is the violence that they face in their everyday lives, and how this sort of manifests in the workplace. It manifests through like sexual harassment at the workplace. So what happens then is that sexual harassment at the workplace becomes a huge deterrent. So I just want us to talk a little bit more about that, maybe, because it's not just about women participating in the workforce. It's also about us having the chance to stay there, to sustain ourselves in the workforce. So how do you think violence inhibits women from accessing decent paid employment of their choice? And we should not just talk about paid work. I'm talking about sustaining ourselves in paid, decent, and dignified work.
So I think the right to work with dignity and the right to work or exist without being subjected to violence is a fundamental right. And when it comes to women, it is not recognized with the gravity that it deserves. And sexual harassment at the workplace is very real, and it needs to be, combated, etc., etc. But having said all this, and for example, I'm the chair of the Sexual Harassment Committee at Ashoka University. So obviously I take all of this very seriously. But again, just as on the demand side, supply side, my views are a little bit non-mainstream. Even on this question, I would like to present an alternative set of facts which makes it a little less mainstream. So when you see the recorded decline, for example, in the female labor force participation rate in India, which started around 2011 a little bit, but basically from 2014, it's been a steady decline, right? So one argument I made already is that this is not number of women declining, it's the amount of work that women do in paid that's getting recorded as a decline. That's one story. The other is when you put this along with reported crime. So when you look at the National Crime Records Bureau data in India, at the macro level, I don't see any relationship. So the decline has been exclusively rural. Urban labor force participation rates have always been low, and they've stayed low. Relative to urban, rural were higher, and they have declined. Those have declined. Even within rural areas is the scheduled tribe women, the Adivasi women, whose work, amongst the social groups, that has declined. Now, is there any data to suggest that sexual violence at the workplace, or just in general, was disproportionately directed towards rural scheduled tribe women? I don't see that in the data at the national level. So That's one. The other is when we've looked at, along with Jitendra Singh, my student, we also did international correlations. The gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, again, is not exclusive to India. So you have, and in fact, in the West, it's much better reported because women, the systems of support are better. Women are able to go out and report, etc. So when you try to correlate incidents of crimes against women and their labor force participation rate, the correlation is really weak. So my submission is, again, I know it's not a popular view, but my submission is that there are two very serious problems and they both reflect patriarchal societies, but one doesn't cause the other, unfortunately, or fortunately. I think that they both need to be looked at, and I think they are both expressions of patriarchy. So in a larger sense, of course, they are connected. But at least I have not found any immediate causal relationship between women. So, for example, in National Sample Survey data, women are asked, if there was work available close to near your home, would you take it up? There's an overwhelming response saying yes. The Naila Kabir and I, we did a primary survey in West Bengal in 7 districts. Overwhelming majority of women that we interviewed said, yes, we would like to work if possible. But they also report gender-based violence, right? So to what extent is gender-based violence a deterrent to accepting work? Of course, it can happen. I'm not saying that there could be women who would say, I would have worked, but I'm afraid of being violently attacked. Of course, that can happen. I'm sure that one can find cases like that. But on average, in the aggregate, in the macro picture, the correlation between the two is not as big as it is. As I'm sorry, I'm questioning many of the widespread beliefs, but that's...
Ashwini, I think this is a very, very interesting insight. And perhaps what I think we would all perhaps agree with you, that it's not a question of correlation. It's not that because of violence, women are not entering paid work. And you've very importantly shown that statistics, for example, does not support this sort of a contention. But I think what is very critical to understand perhaps is that the kind of violence they face at the workplace, sexual harassment, as well as the domestic violence women face on an everyday basis at home, all of these create very debilitating situations for her in terms of, her mental health, her physical health, her ability to, do work, good work, her productivity, and all of these things.
No, I mean, what I'm saying is that what I said in the beginning, which is, it is every person's fundamental right to not be subjected to violence. But when it comes to women, somehow it is not, so if public spaces are not free, are not safe for women, the advice is, okay, stay at home. Why? I mean, why should I stay at home because the roads are not safe? In fact, actually, the more of us that we go out on the streets will become safer. So the advice has to be exactly the opposite of what is given,
And also our homes are not safe. Our homes are sometimes the most unsafe places also.
Yeah, exactly. So that is the other thing, which is that when we talk about women's safety, the entire thing is on, street safety, which is important, no doubt. But the majority of violence that women face come from their homes, people known to them. So the point is, I think that the conversation on gender-based violence is very important. It's massive, and it has to be carried out on an urgent footing. And as you said, it has debilitating consequences for women. But I don't see a direct connection between labor force participation and violence. That's the only point I'm making. Having said that, of course, should women be given access to good transportation where they're not going to be molested? Of course, yes. At the workplace, should there be structures in place that prevent them from being molested, or that they are able to report if they are molested? Of course, yes. And so you can think of a number of initiatives that must be carried out on a very urgent footing, and a genuine recognition of this policy. But the policy prescription should be exactly opposite of what is given today. Instead of saying, because you are subjected to violence, stay at home, the policy should say, go out so that big streets become safer. Go and work in establishments so that there's better gender balance. Because the fewer women there are in any establishment, the more likely it is that, because she doesn't have a network, she doesn't have supporters, people think that they can get away with behaving obnoxiously. Whereas the greater the number of women in an establishment, you can see that it's going to be that much more difficult. So the policy should be turned on its head.
I mean, speaking of violent spaces, I mean, I completely agree with Ashwini because for the past, I mean, I work with a digital media platform, and for a lot of it, I have to curate news. And I remember just the starting of the lockdown till I would say November 2020, there were overwhelming number of reports of women facing domestic violence. Like the number of calls, number of distress calls skyrocketed. So, talking about this, spheres of violence is something that I completely agree with because working women reported like facing large number of women reported facing intimate partner violence. So, it's talking about violence in that aspect. I think this conversation in that sense has been very enlightening for me because earlier I would think of these spaces as something that are two things that are separate to each other. So the violence like women face at home, and then the violence women face at the workplace, very different. Maybe like having access to decent, paid, and safe workplaces is something that can empower me. Yes, but I completely agree with what we're saying that we need to make quite a lot of changes and radical changes at the policy level.
And also, very interestingly, I feel that given that a large number of women are there in home based work, the kind of domestic violence women face at home actually becomes the violence at workplace because for them, the site of home is the site of work. So one needs to really unpack these ideas. But I think, I mean, what we can say is that, as you pointed out, Ashwini, that the right to a violence free life is a fundamental right, as is the right to work. And when they come together, it creates an enabling space for women to work and to live with dignity. Let's put it there. But by the way, it has been a fantastic, fantastic conversation with you. And really, thank you so much. But I just want to quickly run through some of the key points and I think very, very interesting points that you raised. And I think one of the most important things that you said, what you began your conversation with, is that it is not that there are less women working, but there are less opportunities for women to work. So these are demand side constraints. So we need to create more opportunities for women to work. I think that stood out really importantly for me. And also the other question that women are working in different spaces, and sometimes yes, they are working on family farms, family enterprises, and the problem is that their contribution to that is not recognized. They are not counted as workers, while men who are working in similar enterprises are actually counted as workers. So the question is of counting, of valuation, and how do we value their contribution, and this not only at the level of family and community but at the level of the state. How do we actually accord that value? And also, I think some of the very important points that you have raised is when we look at barriers, we also have to look at different levels and of occupations, the particular context, the nature of work women do. So if we look at the paid work they are doing outside, yes, there would be wage gaps. There would be different occupations that men or women are working in. So occupational segregation in the same occupation, they would be at different levels, and there that would entail different kinds of discrimination. And also for women who are working as unpaid helpers in, say, family farms, family enterprises, it is the question of not having equal right over the income that is generated through that family enterprise. So they are contributing, but they are not actually, in that sense, having the equal control over the incomes, the returns from that work. I think that is a very, very critical point. And I think another very important point that stood out is the vicious cycle that you talked about. Because women are working at home, especially in the unpaid care and domestic work segment. Therefore, they are not being able to step out and do paid work. Again, because they are not stepping out to do paid work, therefore, that entire burden of unpaid care and domestic work is falling even more on her shoulders. So that creates a vicious cycle, and we need to be able to step out and break out from that vicious cycle. And we also discussed a very important point, which is about how some of the feminine roles get extended into our workplaces. And this is not only true at the bottom layer of the occupations, but also at the higher levels, even in sort of even in the highest level of corporate offices, you have women performing some of these feminine roles, and they're expected to do that. So this is a sort of patriarchy which is which is not just about not operating only at a family level or at certain segments in the labor market, but across. And I think the state, the markets, all of them participate in what we call perhaps public patriarchy, if we may use that term. And finally, I think we had this really wonderful discussion on violence, which made us also question some of the ways in which we respond to the issue of violence on women. And instead of sort of asking our women to stay back so that they are safe, the focus should be on asking all women to go out and claim the streets, claim the public spaces, claim the offices, claim all the sites of work and enjoyment and everything. So it's about more visibility, more participation, which will actually enable us to create safer and better places. So thank you so much, Ashwini. This has been such a wonderful session and so much of learning. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Ashwini, for joining us today and giving us the opportunity to talk to you. I would just say what a great start to the series. And yep, thank you again.
Thank you very much for this conversation. It was really, really nice. And, it's a sort of a formally meeting both Purnima and Nilanjana for the first time today. Although I've met, we've seen each other, I guess, in cyberspace somewhere. But it's been really great. And thank you very much for inviting me to this podcast.
It was great having you. And to our listeners, I just want to say that if you like this episode, please do subscribe to Women in Work, Why It Matters on your favorite podcast streaming platforms. We'll meet you again in the next episode where we will talk a little bit more about paid and unpaid work specifically and find out if domesticity and domestic work really are that different. Um, this podcast is brought to you by International Center for Research on Women and Feminism in India. You can find more about ICRW's work on their website, that is www.icrw.org/Asia, and find them on Twitter and Facebook at ICRW Asia. You can also find more about FII on www.feminisminindia.com or follow FII on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Feminism in India. And if people want to know more about your work, Ashwini, where can they find you online? How can they know more about your work, read the fantastic research that you've done?
I'm on Twitter, so you can follow me on Twitter. My handle is at AshW, so it's one word, capital ASHW, Deshpande with the capital DESHPANDE. So at AshW Deshpande. That's my Twitter handle. I tweet about my work and also CEDA, which is the center that I'm the director of at Ashoka. CEDA also has a Twitter handle at CEDA Ashoka. And the CEDA website, which is www.ceda.ashoka.edu.in, has all the data narratives where most of us, and I particularly, my research, I make popular short data narratives and talk about that. Of course, you can visit my Ashoka web page where the longer papers are there. So you can engage with in any form. But do follow CEDA on Twitter, and you can watch out for me also on Twitter. I'm not on Instagram, so that's just Twitter. Yeah,
that's fine. I think it's somewhere you don't want to be. We are addicted. But to everyone listening, you'll also find all of these links in the description. So don't worry about it. Don't worry about finding them online. Again, great talking to you, Ashwini.
Hey, let me also say bye.
Nilanjana has to say bye.
Yes, thank you, Ashwini. It's been a great journey with you. Thank you.